Today is Tuesday, September 12th, 2023, and this is the Dunkley Report. The toll of the earthquake that devastated Morocco is on stark display in dozens of remote villages across the North African county's disaster zone. In the village of Tafagakta, for instance, more than half of the 160 inhabitants are thought to have died. With most of the community flattened, survivors worked Monday to clear debris, recover the dead, and steer the living away from buildings teetering on the edge of collapse. The villagers toiled in a scene of horror. The air was filled with the stench of dead cattle. Other animals remained trapped in debris. Owned by his top military officials handling his nuclear-capable weapons and munitions factories, North Korean leader Kim Jong arrived in Russia on Tuesday, where he is expected to hold a rare meeting with President Vladimir Putin that has sparked Western concerns about a potential arms deal for Moscow's war in Ukraine. John Haji-Yu, spokesperson of South Korea's defense ministry, said in a briefing that the South's military assesses that Kim's train crossed into Russia sometime early Tuesday. Associated Press journalists near the North Korea-Russia border saw a green train with yellow trim, similar to one used by Kim on previous foreign trips, at a station on the North Korean side on Monday. Bells tolled at Ground Zero, and solemn tributes unfolded across the country as Americans looked back on the horror and legacy of 9/11. People gathered Monday at memorials, firehouses, city halls, campuses, and elsewhere to observe the 22nd anniversary of the deadliest terror attack on U.S. soil. Nearly 3,000 people were killed when hijacked planes crashed into New York's World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a rural Pennsylvania field. Vice President Kamala Harris joined the ceremony at the Trade Center. President Joe Biden spoke to service members and their families at a ceremony on a military base in Anchorage, Alaska. The U.S. government is taking aim at what has been an indomitable empire, Google's ubiquitous search engine. An antitrust trial will swing into full force Tuesday in a Washington, D.C. federal courtroom. The case marks the biggest U.S. antitrust trial since regulators went after Microsoft a quarter-century ago to challenge Microsoft's dominance in personal computer software. The 10-week trial comes years after the Justice Department alleged Google abused the power of its search engine in ways that stifle competition. The government says Google's practices increasingly force consumers to settle for inferior search results. A major rescue operation in Turkey's Taurus Mountains has brought out an American researcher who fell seriously ill 9 days ago, about 3,000 feet from the entrance of one of the world's deepest caves. Mark Dickey is a 40-year-old explorer and a cave rescuer himself. He became stricken with severe stomach bleeding September 2nd. There were several other people with him on the mission to map the deep cave system. By Monday, teams of international rescuers had moved him up to a level about 330 feet from the surface. He was brought out early Tuesday. Authorities in Pennsylvania, who have been trying to capture an escaped murderer for nearly 2 weeks, say that they're shifting to a longer-term strategy and defended their efforts to this point. Robert Clark, the supervisor of the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force in Philadelphia, said during a news conference Monday that law enforcement teams have the advantage now that Danilo Souza Cavalcante is apparently in suburban Philadelphia rather than the heavily wooded and more complicated terrain of the initial search area. This comes after police say Cavalcante slipped through the search perimeter, stole a delivery van, and abandoned it about 20 miles north. Cavalcante escaped from prison on August 31st after being sentenced to life for killing an ex-girlfriend in 2021. President Joe Biden has wrapped up a 5-day diplomatic sprint through Vietnam and India that put a spotlight on complicated relationships he believes will be crucial for global stability. The whirlwind visit demonstrated that as Russia's war on Ukraine plods on, Biden appears to have become more willing to look past differences with imperfect partners that he badly needs to keep close for the sake of stability in the Indo-Pacific, Middle East, and beyond. Biden closed out his Asia trip on Monday by spotlighting new business deals and partnerships with Vietnam. He is also celebrating the communist government's elevation of the U.S.-Vietnam relationship to a higher level. Hurricane Lee is whipping up waves of more than 15 feet as the Category 3 storm cranks through open waters just north of the Caribbean region. The storm is not expected to make landfall this week. It was located about 410 miles north of the northern Leeward Islands on Monday, with maximum sustained winds of 120 miles per hour. A high surf advisory is in effect for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The National Hurricane Center says Lee is likely to pass just west of Bermuda late Thursday and Friday and be located offshore of the mid-Atlantic states and New England by the end of the week. Filipinos began arriving in Hawaii more than a century ago to work on sugarcane and pineapple plantations to support their families back home. As their descendants and successive generations of immigrants settled, they have become deeply ingrained in the community's culture. Since an inferno raced through the historic town of Lahaina, though, many who have worked to clean hotel rooms are now staying in them as temporary shelters, a poignant example of how the deadliest U.S. wildfire in more than a century has afflicted Maui's heavily Filipino population. The disaster has prompted fears about whether Filipinos, native Hawaiians, and others who labor in the tourism industry will remain as Lahaina rebuilds. Spanish soccer is ready to move forward 3 weeks after its women's team won the Women's World Cup, but had its celebrations marred by a kiss that ignited a crisis. Luis Rubiales resigned late Sunday following weeks of relentless pressure after the Spanish Soccer Federation president kissed a player on the lips without her consent during the trophy ceremony in Australia last month. The decision was expected to help Spanish soccer start overcoming one of its most embarrassing chapters. It should also clear the way for Spain to get back on track with its bid to host the Men's World Cup in 2030, along with Portugal, Morocco, and possibly Ukraine. Today's news was reported by the Associated Press. This has been the World News for Tuesday, September 12th, 2023. Thanks again for joining us at The Dunkley Report